Good evening again. The drill still holds. If you haven't eaten your dessert, feel free to eat it while our program continues. They're not going to take up the dessert if you don't, but I hope you've enjoyed your dinner. It's great to be here at the Inn at Ole Miss. We didn't have anything this grand when I was here. It's wonderful to be able to have a facility like this. Before we get into our program, there are two or three people I wanted to mention as a point of personal privilege. One is we talked about Julie Finley Cooper being the highest ranking editor who's serving as an editor in Mississippi, who is a former editor of the Mississippian. I want to recognize what I consider the dean of Mississippi editors, who was on the staff of the Mississippian in the 50s, Charles Dunnigan. Charles, we're glad you're here. And then Will was gracious enough to make a reference to the Center for Southern Journalism and Politics. There really wouldn't be a Center for Southern Journalism and Politics if we didn't have the creativity and the good work of Curtis Wilkie, who defined Southern journalism and politics. Curtis? I went up to Governor Winter just before the program, before the dinner started, and I said, Governor, I have this idea about changing the program. And he's always nice to me, and so rather than saying, are you out of your mind, he said, oh, really? And I said, my thought was that we would get Robert Keynote to give the keynote address. And he said, well, that's a good idea. And I said, and have you play the guitar. And Elise stepped in and said, no, we're not going to do that. So we keep the program as it was originally intended. I will say in all sincerity, people sometimes ask questions about who do you most admire? Who are your heroes? And maybe it's not even fashionable for journalists in particular to have heroes, but you know, we're people too. And I will say this outside of this room in Washington, D.C. and other places, so I ought to say it when they are here. I tell people when I'm asked that question, I have two heroes, William Winter and Robert Keynote. And how lucky we are. How lucky we are to have them both here on our program tonight. And we're honored by that. I told William that I think I've heard him speak more than any other public official. And he winced at that as if maybe that was a little bit of a criticism. But I told him I always want to come back for more. And I would say most of you in this room have probably heard him speak more than anybody else because he's so generous with his time. And rather than give a fulsome introduction, which I could and would do, of my own comments about Governor Winter, I thought I'd just give just a brief comment about when he received the John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award in 2008. I know the judges of that, a few of the judges of that board, and I knew when they were considering him. And so that's a really big award to get that. And he was recognized and got that award because of his, quote, courageous decisions of conscience during his lifetime. And Caroline Kennedy said, his lifetime of public service, both to his country and his beloved state of Mississippi, has been distinguished by his devotion to equality and justice. Welcome with me the editor of the Mississippian from 1943, William Winter.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Charles. I'm going to talk about you later. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you Liz and your committee for letting me have a place here tonight. As you know, I never turn down an opportunity to be with a crowd like this. This is my crowd. Has it really been 100 years? It seems like only yesterday. I remember it well. Well, maybe I wasn't there at the beginning. But would you believe 71? That really is how long it has been since I wrote my first story for the Mississippian. I will never forget that fall of 1940, arriving as one of the greenest freshmen ever to come out of rural Mississippi. I was totally overwhelmed by the huge student body of 1,500. The largest enrollment in the history of the University of Mississippi. With my beanie cap on my shaved head, I was approached a few days after I arrived by a student who identified himself as the editor of the campus newspaper. He told me that he was Tom Hammond and that he was a member of the fraternity that I had just pledged. Well, I wasn't even sure what that was because it was the second one that I had pledged in 2 weeks. But that's another story for another day. Anyway, Tom Hammond thought that it would be a good learning experience for me to join the Mississippian. And I said, "What's that?" He patiently explained to me what it was, and he thought that I would be expected to write articles and conduct interviews and do things like that. I agreed, not sure what I was getting myself in for. And then a few days later, at the first meeting of the staff, Editor Hammond pulled me aside and told me that he was going to give me a very important first assignment. He said that the author Harry Kroll was coming to the campus, and he wanted me to interview him. I was impressed. I assured him that I was an expert on writing and that I, in fact, intended to be a writer myself. But as soon as I got out of the office, I hurried up to a senior member of the staff, and I asked him, "Who is this Harry Kroll fellow?" "Oh," he said, "he's one of the most widely read authors in the South. More folks around here read his books than they do William Faulkner's." I said, "Who is William Faulkner?" I will not go further into this embarrassing beginning to my young newspaper career other than to say that somehow I got through the interview with some assistance and got my first byline. I knew, though, that this was not my field. But then the sports editor, who was also in my fraternity, whatever that was, told me that he needed a sports writer. And I knew then I'd found my place because nobody had to tell me who Bruiser Kennard was. And thus I began my unspectacular career on the Mississippian, which led eventually to my election as managing editor and then as editor. All of this took place as World War II was getting underway, and that brought a massive change to our way of life on this campus, as it did throughout the country. As our student body, civilian student body, because there were a lot of military people here by now, our civilian student body dropped by more than 50% by the time I left to go into the Army with my ROTC unit at the end of the 1943 spring semester. At the beginning of that 1943 semester, I had become editor when Albert Wilson, a brilliant young man, left to pursue his studies in medical school. My managing editor was Fraser Furr, and my sports editor was Joe Wagner. They would both be killed in action before the war's end. All three presidents of the student body during those years, Gus Gerard, Bill Sam, and Herman Baxter, would also be lost in battle. And in one of my last editorials in May of 1943, I took note of the difficult times. In an editorial headline, "What about the Mississippian?" I wrote these words. Word came from State College this week that the Reflector, the splendid newspaper of the Maroons, no, not the Bulldog, of the Maroons, had succumbed to the problems of war. The authorities announced that Mississippi State College publications were at an end for the duration, as they were for many other college papers throughout the country. And there was some consideration given to whether or not the Mississippian would continue. But the fact is that the Mississippian did continue, and it continued because, first of all, the support of the local advertisers, but more importantly because of the support of the administration and because of the dedication of that small staff of writers who wanted to continue that newspaper to exist. But despite all of the dislocations that accompanied the war, Ole Miss and the Mississippi emerged from that 4-year conflict intact and stronger than ever. Much of that was due to the leadership of Ole Miss women. Marilyn Howell, right back here, Marilyn Howell, an extraordinary leader, was elected ASB president in the spring of 1943. And I worked in her campaign, I am proud to say. And then Miriam Horn and Huldah Cousins became editors of the Mississippi in the following 2 years. They led the way to the inspirational role that women have played in the history of Ole Miss since that time. I may be doing too much reminiscing here now, but what are reunions for if not for reminiscing? And what a wonderful setting here tonight for talking about who we are and where we have come from. At the beginning of these remarks, I may have exaggerated, but only by a little, how most Mississippians of the 1930s and the 1940s, how little we Mississippians of that time understood what really was going on in the world.